Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. When you think of African history, you think mostly of Egypt and Samaria, but it's time to shed some attention to other great civilizations. 10,000 years ago, North Africa was green, herds of animals. Early African hunters learned to domesticate the cow, and they could use the cow for milk, for meat. However, overbreeding brought overpopulation of cows, too much grazing. The grass took longer to grow back. The cattle would stamp on the grass, trampling it underfoot. Rain can't seep into the earth, so it runs off. The grass dies, less oxygen in the air, less rain, rivers shrink. Lakes evaporate, deposits of salt remain. This cycle repeats, and then you get desert, mainly the Sahara, which grew and is still growing today. So Africans flee the arid desert and go south towards Lake Chad. And then northern nomads moved into the desert with sheep, donkeys, and goats that could live off the shrubbery. They carved out a living with a trade in salt and slaves. Now, because some of the wildlife areas in the south were not hospitable to cows, the Africans tended to leave that to the wildlife. So with the African desert in the north and the wildlife to the south, many kingdoms were isolated. About 2,300 years ago, Asians called the Malay crossed the ocean, eventually reaching Madagascar and the mainland. And they encountered the farmers in Africa called the Bantu. The Asians brought the taro and bananas, which the Bantu adopted as their own. The Bantu tribes spread over all of South Africa. In the kingdom of Cush were the Nubians. Now, King Alara unified the Nubians and established Napata as the capital. The Nubians would mine gold. They would raid villages, they would capture slaves, and sell gold and slaves to Egypt. Now, the Nubians and the Egyptians constantly fought. In 300 AD, an Ethiopian king, King Ezama, made Christianity an official religion and attacked the Nubians. He sacked the capital, and the Nubians declined. And yet, the Nubians in Cush, they held so much power they even ruled Egypt during the 25th dynasty. They acquired Egyptian customs. Its capital, Meroe, holds ruins of 200 pyramids, more than all of Egypt combined. Hundreds of years later, Arabia swept over North Africa and encountered the tribes of the Berbers. This was after Muhammad introduced Islam. This is for another video. But for the moment, the Arabs persuaded a king, King Kusaila of the Al-Raba people, to become Muslim. So the Berber people converted to Islam, but when the Arabs, looking for loot and money, pillaged King Kusaila's lands, the king told the Arabs that he would leave. So sadly, King Kusaila gathered his people and went into exile. It was a bluff. He came back in a sneak attack, slaughtered the Arabs, and ruled North Africa for 10 years. But eventually, North Africa would become Islamic, and it is still Islamic today. With the introduction of the camel, it was used to cross the Sahara Desert. This would take a month, but it helped increase communication and trade. Now, the Soninke people had established the Kingdom of Ghana, and all gold from Sudan had to pass through Ghana, and the king would take a cut. These trade caravans passed through Sijil Masa, an outpost in the desert that became a huge trade center. Now, ancient writings talk of trade with the kingdom of Punt, ivory, blackwood, ebony, animals such as the leopards and the apes, myrrh. Egypt would send trade expeditions, huge caravans. Yet strangely enough, for a long time, we really didn't know where Punt was. We guess it's over here in East Africa. In Ethiopia, Queen Makeda took power and she ruled for 50 years. It was part of a trading empire that included Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. Anyway, Ethiopians narrate that Queen Makeda was the biblical Queen of Sheba who visited King Solomon of Israel, and that when she returned to her homeland, she gave birth to a son named Menelik, and that this baby was a son of King Solomon. Whether he was Solomon's son or not, Menelik became king, and his descendants would rule Ethiopia for 3,000 years, all the way to 1974, when the last Ethiopian king, King Haile Selassie I, was overthrown by a Marxist dictator. In North Africa, the kingdom of Carthage was a major commercial center for half a millennium. Gold, silver, copper, textiles, its ports could dock 200 ships. It would trade across the Mediterranean to Spain. It controlled Sicily. But because of its location, when Rome began expanding and trading, tensions grew. In 264 BCE, Carthage and Rome went to war in what was called the First Punic War. Now, Carthage had the largest navy, but the troops were mostly mercenary. Rome was superior on land. Now, Rome built 100 warships in 2 months. It innovated and, with military ingenuity, beat the Carthaginians in 7 years. A peace treaty was signed, and Carthage had to evacuate Sicily. 218 BCE, the Second Punic War, Carthage attacks Rome, this time by land, and here we have to talk about General Hannibal. Hannibal leads his troops and 36 elephants through land, through Spain, through most of the Alps. Many of his elephants froze and died, and he reached Italy. Now, Hannibal won major battles against the Romans, terrifying the people. But then he had to call for reinforcements, and the Carthaginians had to refuse because they were also fighting in Sicily and Spain. So Hannibal was on his own. Now, the city of Rome held out, and the Roman navy cut off supplies to Carthage. Now, Hannibal tried to make allies of the people around the city of Rome, but they also refused. Romans had to be given credit. They were proud and resourceful. They would not give in despite major setbacks. So Hannibal tried to starve out the city of Rome. Meanwhile, his men ravaged the countryside for food, earning the hatreds of the Romans. So this went on for 15 years. Now, Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, was fighting in Hispania, which is today's Spain. He finally set out to help Hannibal, but it was too late. Hannibal had left Italy and returned to Carthage. The Romans beat the Carthaginians again. Now, Hannibal became a statesman, a very good one. But later on in life, he cut his finger on a sword, got an infection, and died. Now, Hannibal was so fierce that the Romans had a famous Latin phrase they still use today. Whenever trouble hits you, it is common to exclaim, Hannibal ante portas, which means Hannibal is at the gates. Yet the Romans held great admiration for Hannibal as a worthy adversary, and statues of him were built all over Rome. Future French General Napoleon Bonaparte said that Hannibal was one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. 30 years later was a third Punic War, and Rome destroyed Carthage, bringing it to ruin. All that's left of it today is the country of Tunisia. Tunisia was a site used for the desert scenes from the Star Wars films. Now, it's fine that we hear so many stories of the gladiator Spartacus, who led the slave revolt in Rome. But if we move forward to 869 AD, you don't hear that much about Ali ibn Muhammad. Ali ibn Muhammad led the Zanj slave revolt. South Iraq had been in the slave trade with East Africa for years. Now, the Zanj slaves were transported to South Iraq, and Ali ibn Muhammad led the slave revolt and held South Iraq for 14 years before dying in battle. We don't know the number of dead. The estimates are from 500,000 to 2.5 million. South Iraq lost its position of power with other rivals as it was preoccupied with the slave revolt, and economic activities were greatly affected. Now, there were countless wars between the kingdoms of Ghana and Egypt. And in a future video, I want to talk about Islam, Muhammad, and how the Muslims dominated much of Africa. We're going to talk about the kingdom of Mali. We're going to start with the story of a woman named Sogolon Konde. Sogolon Konde was a hunchback, a woman so ugly that people would tease her and call her the Buffalo Woman. She had a son named Sundiata Keita. Now people really teased her because her son was born crippled. So now she was the Buffalo Woman and her crippled son. Yet she proved to be of strong character, so much so that the king of Mema put her in an administrative position in his kingdom. And then later, when the Mandika people of West Africa were conquered by King Soso, the Mandikas approached Sogolon's son, Sundiata Keita, to help them. Sundiata Keita obtained an army from the king of Mema, formed a brotherhood and led the liberation of the Mandican people and the foundation of the city of Mali. Mali would grow, dynasties would rule, and Mali grew into an empire as the decades went by. Then came a king of Mali, the king Abu Bakari Keita II. God love him. He wanted to see how large the Atlantic Ocean was, so he had 200 ships built, put someone else in charge of his kingdom to rule in his absence. He went out to sea and was never seen again. Now, who did Abu Bakari put in charge? Mansa Musa, who would become the richest person in all of history. Mansa Musa would conquer 24 cities, urbanize the Mali Empire, expand culture, and acquire the trade center of Timbuktu. Mansa Musa's fortune in today's currency would equal $400 billion, over 4 times what Bill Gates is worth today. And how did Mansa Musa get so rich? Well, the kingdom of Mali had many gold mines, and gold was in great demand, especially in Western Europe. And Mansa Musa, a Muslim, decided to take a pilgrimage to the city of Mecca. He took with him 60,000 men, each carrying 4 pounds of gold, camels carrying 50 to 300 pounds of gold dust. They were all dressed in silk, many with golden staffs. They made their way to Mecca, and every Friday, Mansa Musa would have a mosque built. Now, along the way, Mansa Musa gave away so much gold on this trip to kings and peasants alike that it devalued the gold, affecting the economy for decades. Now, by the 1600s, the Mali Empire had grown weak, with all the rivals coming in trying to divide it into 3 kingdoms. Eventually, it fell victim to colonialism, just like most of Africa. But in the 1700s, the Mandikas of Mali produced one famous individual in the Mandikan village of Jufur in Gambia. A man named Kunta Kinte was captured, put on a slave ship, and taken to the Americas, where one of his descendants, Alex Haley, would write the historical novel Roots, a cultural achievement. Now, the videos in this series are very brief. It barely scratches the surface, so I hope that you are inspired to study and read about the often neglected history of Africa. There's a lot of story here, a lot of history. But for my next video, we're going to venture out and talk about the ancient Romans. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this. Comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.